Okay, so yes, so Professor Cripps, the first question is, could you give us a short introduction of yourself and tell us what courses you teach?
Okay, hi. Well, I'm Martin Cripps. I've been at UCL since 2007. And before that, I've been in a bunch of other places. My primary research interest is in game theory and learning. And so what I teach is the core microeconomics course for the second years. This is just called microeconomics, joint with Ian Preston. And I tend to focus on the game theory / industrial economics end of that. And then I also teach PhD students. So I teach the same core micro for the PhD students, again, game theory. And kind of surprisingly, there's quite a lot of links between what I'm teaching the PhD students and what I'm teaching the undergraduates. And there's a bit of kind of to and fro between those courses, which is quite surprising, but nice.
Thank you so much for that. And the second question is, like, you spoke about your interest in game theory and how you've been preparing a course in mathematics. So how exactly did you get into economics?
Well, that's a weird story. And I guess lots of us, it's by accident, because at schools, economics is not something you learn very early on in your career at school. And so I was interested in mathematics and history. I really liked both of those. And I went to a kind of very ordinary school where it wasn't possible to do lots and lots of mathematics, which would have been my first aim, to go to uni to do maths. And so I had economics and I had mathematics as two things I wanted to do for A level, and I had to come up with a third. And economics was it, really. It goes very nicely with history and mathematics, and that's how I got into economics. It was just a fluke. It was filling a gap in my A levels.
And what pushed you?
But actually, but then I was to say something else. There was something underlying that. So there's this Isaac Asimov novels called Foundation, where he talks about being able to predict what will happen to economies and worlds in the future.
Yeah.
And I remember reading that as a sixth former and finding that those ideas very appealing. And so that's what led me to want to specialize in math, econ, and econometrics. The idea that we could use math and statistics to predict the future of humans seemed to be just amazing and wonderful. So I thought that was very intriguing.
So now you talked about yourself, obviously being an academic and a professor. So I'm pretty sure you interact a lot with students, right? So could you tell us about your most memorable or funny conversation that you've had with a student?
Well, this is a long time ago, and it's not particularly funny. It's a little bit embarrassing, really. I was a very young academic, and I set a take-home math final for the MSc students at Warwick that I was teaching, and they always did very well on it. And but after a while, a deputation of two students knocked on my door and were absolutely convinced that I'd made a mistake on this exam and asked them to do something that's impossible. And they were so convincing, and they kind of already talked to various other of my colleagues, and they'd almost convinced me that I'd made a mistake. And finally, I just kind of said, "Oh, okay, go away." And thought a bit about it, and I realized I hadn't. But what's interesting about the whole story, it's a very common event for anyone, is who those two students were. One of them was Andrew Haldane, who's now chief economist at the Bank of England. And the other one was Spencer Dale, who was also chief economist at the Bank of England, but is now chief economist at Shell BP. So they were very impressive people even then, and they could convince me that I was wrong. I was actually right.
The next question is, could you show us a favorite book, an inspirational picture, or a note that you hang in your office, something that we can learn from and just get an insight with?
Well, I'm not sure you will learn an awful lot. You can see I'm sitting in a room at the top of my house, right. And up here we store old books, and I've got a run of 24 books from this guy, Terry Pratchett.
Okay.
And I love Terry Pratchett. So if I had to recommend anything to anyone who's feeling down or just needs a break from their studying, it would be read Terry Pratchett, in particular, Going Postal, which is my favorite of his novels. They're witty, wise, and wonderful. How about that for alliteration?
He's very good at constructing, realities and universes, I think, in his book. Like, I've read a few of his books and they're very, very good. And yeah, so now moving on to a slight thought experiment and just a creative side to the interview. If you could ask one question to anyone in the world, alive or dead, economist or not, and who would you ask what question to?
Well, so I restricted it to economists.
Okay.
So, and I was thinking, I don't know, many people will know this person unless they've already learned quite a bit of economics. But there's a man called Frank Ramsey, who wrote probably two of the most important papers on growth theory and taxation. He also translated Wittgenstein and did foundational work in probability theory. And he also created a whole area of mathematics to do with graphs and connected components on graphs. It's called Ramsey theory. What you don't know is he died when he was 28 years old. Of the jaundice. He created all that before he was 28 and then he died. A remarkable man, absolutely amazing. I would just like to ask him what next. What would he want to do next? Because it's so sad that we don't know, and it would be fascinating if we could have asked him.
And final question. I mean, this is like kind of a protocol question also, judging by the audience. But yeah, so do you have any advice for incoming or prospective students at UCL?
Yeah. This is only some advice that I've learned for very many years working very hard to produce very little research in economics, really. And the advice, I think, is that things look simple when you're studying economics, usually because someone has worked incredibly hard at it to make it simple. And so we tend to see the world through the facts and the things we've learned about economics from other people. And that makes the world seem simple. But actually, it must have been even more confusing to them because they didn't have the tools they developed. So when you're studying stuff, and when you're even things like Nash equilibrium or game theory, when you're studying that, remember, it looks very simple, but there's someone behind there who's really worked hard and spent maybe their whole life trying to make it look as simple as it does. So don't be upset if other things look very puzzling to you.